Hello, my name is Genevieve Pomeroth, and this is my video about video games and violence. Are there moral distinctions? And my research question is, are violent video games responsible for player violence, or is it the environment around them that shapes this behavior? Often we see tragic episodes of gun violence in the news, and the perpetrator is a young adult. Critics in the media often blame the violence being portrayed in video games for the perpetrator's actions. We can see this from politicians, parents, and even activists claiming that video game violence is inherently linked to violent behavior. However, some critics argue that video game violence does not correlate with violent behavior. While there are studies that support that violent video games influences aggressive behavior, it does not mean that the portrayal pushes the player to replicate those same violent situations. Violence scenes in video games merely replicate the violence, not encourage it. Rather, it's the community surrounding the video game landscape that promote these behaviors. Which brings me to my thesis, which is video games seem to contribute to violence committed by players, but it turns out that the environment in which the players enclose themselves inherently instills this idea that violence is necessary. By investigating the effects of desensitization in the pipeline through which communities around their respective games, we can see how they isolate their groups and encourage this violent behavior. Which brings me to my primary source, which is The Gamer's Dilemma by Morgan Luck, where he raises this important question, which is why do some players see some immoral actions in games, such as virtual murder, as acceptable, while virtual child molestation is completely off limits? Through this question, Luck argues that this inconsistency shows how the game environment shaped our moral boundaries and encouraged certain behaviors while discouraging others, which closely connects to how modern game worlds influence players. The environments they put the players in normalize violence as an encouraged act through mechanics. These mechanics pivot, often make the violence in video games the main objective in order to win. Over time, this design does not doesn't make people violent, but it does make violence feel like it's a routine, like it's the same thing over and over again, which brings up the subject of desensitization. So, why do violent video games cause desensitization? Well, studies show that violent video games do not directly cause violent actions, but they do reduce emotional responsiveness. If we look at the studies done by Nicholas Carnegie in The Effect of Video Game Violence on Physiological Desensitization to Real Life Violence, they found that individuals who play violent video games habitually become physiologically numb to the reaction of real life violence. And they found this by tracking heart rate and GSR, which is galvanic skin reception, which with both the heart rate and the galvanic skin reaction being reduced as these gamers habitually play violent video games, this often indicates desensitization. In other words, it's a repeated exposure makes the violence feel more normal and expected. We can see this again in See the Nguyen's games and the moral transformation of violence, where he explains that the achievement the player cares disposably about the goal, but endearingly about winning. This means that players are conditioned to do whatever it takes to win the game, even if it means to murder. Tim Adams extends this idea in How the Internet Created an Age of Rage, where he explains how de-individualization is what happens when we get behind the wheel and scream at a stranger at a traffic stoplight. That feeling of anonymity behind an avatar or like an anonymous account makes people feel detached from empathy. And not only that, it heightens aggression because they don't actually know who you are. So, wait, well, okay. So, these desensitization alone does not cause violence, but it is paired with isolation. So, why does it have this big role in violence within gamers? Paired with isolation, desensitization and isolation affects the mental health of gamers. And isolation only intensifies that. We can see this in how Megan Candace in Hateful Games explains how the gamer identity becomes territorial, where she explains that games are built as these utopian spaces for game geeky guys, but as the audience diversified, some gamers felt invaded. This explains This makes a lot more sense when you think about how gaming has historically been centered around straight white men. When this dominance is challenged, the backlash emerges in the form of harassment against gamers of marginalized groups and gatekeeping, which creates this toxic environment where not a lot of people feel welcome in this space. Andrew, Craig Anderson explains this. There is through violent video games effects on aggression. And he says that research is needed on video game violent effects on empathy, desensitization, and pro-social behavior. Through this study, Anderson has found that violent game exposure correlates with lower pro-social behavior and empathy, especially when you think about isolated individuals. This is further, this could be furthered after knowing the fact that isolated individuals, their only form of social interaction would be these platforms of games as well as gaming communities. Anna Prescott shows this effect over time in meta-analysis of the relationship of violent video games, video gameplay, and physical aggression over time. She explains that the association with increases in physical aggression over time. Uh, Alessandro Gabbiadini in The Lone Gamer reinforces this thought through social exclusion experiments. So he takes 121 participants and makes them play 20 different games over time. And through the study, it has shown that the players who were excluded and exclusively played violent video games have shown the highest aggressive inclinations within the study, which further supports the idea that isolation increases the susceptibility to violent media. We can also see this in Toxic Play by Luke Munn, that once isolated, some players become vulnerable to extremist online spaces. Munn mentions that hate is often dismissed as part of gaming culture, yet it has significant psychological impact, especially on marginalized groups. This hateful rhetoric is normalized as just gamer culture, while extremist groups disguise their ideology as just minor gamer discourse, taking apart that consequence when it comes to saying that stuff in real life. Combined with desensitization, this normalizes aggression and the dehumanization of people of marginalized groups. So through these studies, the violent games aren't necessarily the issue. It's the vulnerable users who are in danger when it comes to these social interactions, which is also more concerning as to why teens are targeted and why game companies often target their target audience. Game companies target teens because they're the most engaged demographic and still developing socially. We can see this in Thomas F. Denson's and Understanding the Desire to Play Violent Video Games, where he explains that people may play violent video games to satisfy fundamental and psychological needs, express emotions, and seek status. So teenagers often, a lot of them isolate themselves. A majority, I know some people in some cousins in my life who are teenagers, and they often isolate themselves just to play games with their friends. It's very normal, but they especially use the games for social belonging. We can see this in Jeffrey Gottfried's Teens in Video Games Today, where he reports that 8 in 10 US teens say harassment in gaming is a problem, as well as a demographic skew, where it shows that 72% of young men ages 18 to 29 play video games. This means millions of young men are playing, yet only 2% of real violence is linked to gamers. So games aren't really the direct cause. The problem is more of the subset of players that become vulnerable to harmful pipelines. And during the pandemic, we see this isolation increase, and this enlarges the effects of the pipeline. It makes these harmful communities even stronger within this space. So who's to blame? If video games aren't the root cause, why are they being blamed? If we look at Patrick Markey's school shootings blamed on violent video games more often when the perpetrator is white, he reveals that when a perpetrator is stereotyped as a racial minority, people seek external explanations. Thus, media prefers to blame the games instead of addressing. They tend to blame the games instead of addressing the underlying issues that I have already talked about in my previous slides. But when it comes to a perpetrator that is a person of color, it is always blamed on, oh, they're involved with a gang. Oh, they're racial stereotype. The media tends to pinpoint this baseless accusation on games. Not only is it easy, but it also gets people to watch their programs, which is also really screwed up. This scapegoating blocks every kind of meaningful conversation that can come out of this, which is why platform moderation is no longer an option. We can see this in how some gaming and social platforms have taken action to fight against these extremist misuse. But because reporting and the reporting being a voluntary action and the low amount of moderators just in general in the space, these things just get swept under the rug. But according to Linda Schlegel, in countering the misuse of gaming-related content in spaces, she argues that positive interventions support safe gaming communities devoid of extremist content. These platforms, if we think about it, profit off of engagement, even when it's negative. So they rarely enforce meaningful moderation and genuine care for the users that are on their platform. So without that intervention, teens remain exposed to extremist recruitment and harassment. This just shows that addressing violence requires a platform responsibility and not just panicking that Jimmy John is doing this on CS:GO. While violent video games have been the subject of the center of debates in real life violence, Research has shown that they often play a small part in an even larger puzzle. Studies have consistently suggested that video games can increase short-term aggression and desensitization, but these alone can't predict who will be in the news for the next mass shooting. It does not matter in this case is what does matter in this case is that the social environment of the player. There are multitudes of studies that show that isolation and toxic online communities that spread hate shape the beliefs and normalize hostility, thus influencing harmful behavior online and in real life. Violent video games function less as like a direct cause, but as a potential gateway to these communities. Vulnerable individuals who isolate themselves and are susceptible to harmful ideologies such as those of the main players of violent video games. By addressing online hate groups and creating a more inclusive environment and safe environment for gamers, there might be more meaningful solutions to addressing these violent behaviors rather than hyper focusing on the games themselves. And that is my